good evening, everyone. It's kind of really nice to see people I recognize, but also a few new faces too. Um, so, Today, I guess, hopefully, I guess it was one of these things. My title potentially sounded quite arrogant, but the idea is that for me, it's very much this kind of aspirational kind of title that while I'm kind of making I'm sort of thinking about, I mean, am I creating narratives that are worth celebrating? And I think as kind of makers and particularly working with precious metals, there's this kind of constant questioning of what is the value of the work that you're making, and how do you kind of make those meaningful kind of stories, and what is the storytelling that you're sharing through your work? Um, so that in a way is kind of what's framing this evening's kind of meander through my practice. So I'll share a little bit about my kind of philosophy, a bit about how I'm forming my ethical practice, which I'll share it in a relatively vulnerable way in terms of a lot of what I've developed is through making mistakes. And also just continually reflecting on things and actually being quite critical about what you have or haven't done as well. So hopefully, whilst I'm sort of sharing my practice, it's hopefully a point to that you can maybe reflect and relate on how you kind of a how you kind of respond to things in your own practice. Um, for anyone that doesn't know me, I studied at the Glasgow School of Art for my kind of undergraduate degree, graduated from there in 2015. I then went on to do traditional silversmithing at Bishopsland, down in South Oxfordshire for a year. I then kind of went back to Glasgow, which is where I'm from, if you couldn't tell from the accent. And I guess I had my own kind of a workshop, fortunately, after being on a waiting list for a while, and was kind of making full time for roughly a year and a half before the kind of opportunity to undertake my PhD came along. So then I kind of transitioned into kind of research for around kind of 4 years, and then kind of returned back to practice, kind of a mainly kind of part-time. Um, but I think even through the PhD, I was still making, as you'll see in a minute. So I think as a student, I was an ACJ member, and was kind of fortunate to take part in the Sleight of Hand exhibition, which a few of you will likely remember. So this was one of my kind of student kind of pieces for my third year. So I think as a student, I didn't necessarily realize at the time, but it kind of became clear looking back that I was kind of interested in different kind of ethical dilemmas. So whether in my first year, kind of looking at elephant culling, or looking at whether it was the kind of the car industry, how we mine copper, and then again the kind of some of the implications around mining gold. I was very aware that I was exploring lots of kind of ethical issues, and yet I wasn't actually taking any action myself. So I sort of started to feel quite hypocritical in the way that I was practicing. And I did kind of reach the point in my third year of studies, sort of thinking, should I be making anything? On what terms can I be making things? And it was around that point that I sort of decided that in a way I wanted to be part of the problem within the industry to find solutions or better alternatives to the ways I was currently working. And part of that was trying to identify other communities that had some of the same kind of questions or concerns that I had. So something that was kind of really helpful at the time was realizing that there was a kind of community, being the ethical metalsmiths over in the US. So they at the time had kind of forums discussing different kind of materials, etc. Um, and for my fourth year, a kind of degree show, I kind of made the decision at that stage that I was going to make everything in 100% recycled silver. So the kind of eco silver range that Cooks and Gold had at the time. Um, and I was kind of fortunate to win the kind of goblet competition that's kind of hosted annually by the Incorporation of Goldsmiths in Edinburgh. And this kind of funded opportunity gave me the first chance to actually make it's my first kind of piece of silverware, but also my first kind of item that I ever made in recycled silver and the kind of gold plating as well. So it was kind of really exciting to kind of get that ability to make that, and also a bit of the kind of grant then went into the degree show as well. And I guess it was through this opportunity that they made me aware of Fair Luxury, which are a UK-based kind of collective of individuals. Though saying that, they have international kind of connections and members as well. And again, they've kind of been incredibly supportive for me over the last kind of decade or so, in terms of building that kind of community and discussion around the kind of sustainability or responsible kind of elements of my practice. So I definitely recommend looking into them if you haven't already. Um, so again, in terms of these are kind of examples of my degree show, which at the time was using 100% recycled silver and gold. And I'd started to responsibly source gemstones as well. So working kind of closely with gemstone suppliers that I mean, they could tell me exactly where the gemstones had come from. So that was again quite a significant step for me. And I was working with kind of recycled copper signs and things as well for the objects I'd made in base metals. And then I guess once I graduated, I think it was during my interview for Bishop's Land that I was confronted with this question of, obviously I've talked about my degree show being full of recycled materials, but then being asked like why would you recycle silver or gold? It was one of these questions that I actually found really perplexing at the time and didn't quite know how to answer. But it did sort of make me realize that not everybody's necessarily going to understand some of the issues of our practice in the same way. Um, and to be clear about why you're doing things as well. So explaining why I've chosen recycled materials, all of a sudden became quite clear. Um, to actually sort of start to share why you're making some of the decisions in your practice and why it's important. So I think in alignment with that, one of the kind of key things that I do kind of hold really dear to my practice is, I mean, how grateful I am for the opportunities I've had through competitions, but also, I mean, the opportunity to go to university and study and to work with so many amazing craftspeople, whether formally or informally, to sort of share skills, but also sharing sort of ways of working, and I mean, different perspectives on the same kind of issues within our industry. Um, and then I guess obviously at Bishop's Land, I did start to kind of learn more of the kind of traditional silversmithing techniques. 'Cause you might have kind of noticed that almost the degree show work I made was almost like jewellery, but just on a larger scale. So I was kind of starting to move into the more traditional techniques at this stage. I was still making a jewellery as well. I mean, I very much enjoy making silverware and jewellery. I enjoy the kind of connection between the two. But I think one thing to kind of note here with with making the jewellery at the time was that there was a kind of very limited a kind of manufacturing ability, in the sense that you're only buying sheet and wire. So for a things like chains or other kind of findings, I would have to hand fabricate them myself. So this is a kind of indication of maybe how things have changed in terms of trying to access what you might consider responsibly sourced or traceable materials. Um, and again, I guess me now looking back at some of these designs, like now I wouldn't choose to oxidize using chemicals. So there's kind of reflections here that can be made. And again, I think having had a sort of discussion with Melanie Eddy about gold plating jewellery as well, is that the best use of that material? So there's lots of things that you can reflect on over time in your practice. So these are just a few images. Um, I think even though I'd sort of chosen this kind of recycled material as my starting point, there's always been this sort of desire and awareness that but that by buying recycled, I'm not actually supporting a kind of marginalized communities in kind of mining contexts. Um, so one of the things that I guess since even I think I can't remember, it's while I was a student or a kind of recent graduate that I started being part of the Fair Trades, a kind of goldsmith scheme, where you effectively, as part of that scheme, you had to buy at least 1 gram of gold every year in support. So this was very much like gold that I was just gradually accumulating over the years. And I eventually got to the stage where I had enough gold that I was able to I think this was also mixed in with some recycled gold that I had kind of just offcuts and things that enabled me to include some of this gold into these objects. Obviously, from a marketing perspective, I can't communicate that any of that is recycled or especially fair trade, because it's not I've not got that license. But these are some of the ways that um, even if I can't afford the full license, what can you do? So it's kind of recognizing that there's different ways that you can maybe support um, some of the values or communities that are important to you. Um, and I did get to 2017, where I chose to become a Fair Mind licensee. So this was really quite a significant step for me in the sense that you are able to source fair mined silver a lot easier than you can within fair trade. So that was one of the kind of key reasons why I chose fair mined. In addition to, I very much value and still continue to sort of value some of the kind of social and environmental work that they do with communities, but I'll get onto that a bit later in the slideshow. And I think in addition, I've talked an awful lot already about the material, um, but within my practice itself, my work is still inspired by kind of ethical issues. So from the kind of early degree show work, generally it's kind of looking at how we're connected to the universe. But and also I guess some of it can be the sort of the tools that we're building to explore outer space and the different ways that we as humans sort of think about survival. So in the kind of a space exploration context, I mean, we're exploring outer space to identify new kind of routes of living out in outer space. Whereas here on Earth, we've very much got people that are trying to survive day to day. And I was really interested in this kind of a kind of ethical dilemma of, we're investing a significant amount of kind of economic funds into space exploration, and yet the technologies do support things on Earth. So, raising awareness of things like climate change. So these are some of the kind of the themes that are uniting the kind of how my work develops from a design perspective. Um, and you might have noticed already that I'm very much kind of design led rather than sort of technique based. So it's very much following kind of ideas or things, narratives that I'm wanting to share. So for these beakers, for example, hopefully this video will play. Um, so these are, I guess, technically they're hand engraved. So you'll see that kind of almost kind of mosaic-like a pattern. And the kind of motif on the one you're sort of seeing there is a Scotland's national animal, believe it or not, is the unicorn, with the phases of the moon going round. And then the other beaker has a Scottish wildcat with it's almost meant to be kind of like sunbursts going round, so they're kind of in the sunlight. And I created these because the Scottish wildcat is critically endangered. I think the last time I checked, there was around kind of 35 left in the wild. It was very much my hope when I was creating these that the wildcat will continue roaming around in the kind of sunlight and not to become like the elusive unicorn. So I do, I mean, some of my narratives do, they're still, I guess, obviously I've got the kind of the sun and the moon, a kind of relationship there within the beakers, but in a way, when I've got something that I feel is important to say or share, I mean, the narratives do adapt or kind of pivot. Um, so again, these brooches, I guess I've described them here as elemental brooches. So they're each inspired by, I guess, going left to right, I mean, left bottom to the top right. We have earth, air, water, and fire. But really, when I was making them, I was thinking about natural disasters. So we've almost got kind of an earthquake at the bottom, a tornado, which is the kind of swirling motif, to then kind of tsunami. So it's almost the kind of the foam on the water, and then almost like a kind of heat explosion with the fire. And in a way, this is maybe coming from some of my climate change anxieties. So some of the work is literally sharing kind of ethical issues as well as kind of embodying them. So you'll sort of see here, I guess I'm kind of wearing one of these brooches just as a sense of size. But they're really quite subtle brooches in the sense that you do need to see them quite close up, I guess, like with a most not enamel, engraved work. So I'll share very kind of briefly a little bit about my PhD research. Um, so this did kind of have three parts to it. And I was based within a school of physics within Dundee. And what drew me to it was the physicists were effectively looking for someone that was familiar with working with silver, I mean, being the most reflective metal in the kind of visible light spectrum. So here on Earth, I believe it's gold if you're in outer space, which is why there's a lot of kind of technology in space that you'll see it's kind of a mirror finish with gold. Um, so my effectively part of my PhD research was to fabricate a custom optics for a solar laser, which is a novel form of renewable energy. And this was the key reason why I applied for this project, because I was really excited about seeing how our kind of craft practice could really contribute towards clean energy sources. And the shape itself, as you'll see, it's very much a kind of millimeter scale. It almost looks like a stone setting. So again, it's a sort of a size and shape that we're, I mean, as jewelers, very familiar with. So this was kind of taking a time to really understand or to try and get the profile as accurate as I could for this optics. But you'll sort of see on this kind of image towards the bottom is showing the surface quality of rolled out sheets that I was receiving from Cookson's. So it really kind of highlights actually the silver that you're receiving that actually looks quite decent just to the naked eye, really has that kind of that rolled kind of grain embedded within it. So I, you know, spending months and months exploring how to polish silver sheet. Um, so it was kind of really interesting learning about the metals that we work and we're so familiar with from a scientific perspective, and to actually test the reflectivity of the polished surfaces that I was working with. And you might see some relation between the kind of optic shape that I was making there and this set of measuring spoons. Um, so it's kind of, yeah, quite interesting seeing, because I think one of the things I've sort of felt within the interest of my practice is that I've always been slightly separate from the science and the physics that I was really interested in. So another reason why I sort of took the PhD on was so that I could become embedded within that environment. So it was kind of really exciting to have, a significant period of time around scientists to kind of gain that empathy and perspective on how they work, and the personalities within that field. So I guess what I shared just there with the optics, that was very much looking at how craft can aid physics. Whereas this aspect of the project was looking at how physics could aid craft. And again, looking from a sustainable perspective, um, actually using some of the optics, I was able to concentrate sunlight to start heating and manipulating different materials. And a lot of this was more through a kind of a technique-based sampling. So it wasn't about creating contemporary art or jewellery, rather than just proving or understanding in what context could this technique work and in what scale, or what types of enamel worked as well. And you'll see as well on the kind of left-hand side is a graph of different sands that could be sintered. So looking at a natural and local materials to us and how could they be manipulated. Stemming on from my time at the University of Dundee and being embedded within the School of Physics, one of the things that's really quite different is the kind of the gender ratio between the jewellery environment and the physics environment. So whilst we have very few kind of men or anyone identifying as male within the jewellery industry, particularly within like the kind of contemporary scene anyway, it's not necessarily the same in the trades. But within physics, the kind of the ratio of women is very minimal. So I think within the University of Dundee, they were actually doing quite well at having 20% of their kind of staff and students being female. Um, so part of this kind of realization, I really kind of wanted to understand some of their kind of barriers and the kind of stereotypes that they face, but also their love for their science and their practice. So here we have pieces of jewellery that I made for three physicists that responded to how they talked about their research, but also kept in mind their personal preference and response to jewellery. So what some of them didn't really wear jewellery, whereas like Charlotte, for example, she wanted something quite big and bold. And again, in their context, jewellery, we'll hope, would be a natural way that they could start talking about their research and their interests. Because I think many people that I spoke to sort of said that the minute they mentioned they were a physicist, the conversation shut down. So part of the aspiration through this project was to try and open up the conversation through jewellery. So this is the kind of exhibit that we were working towards at the McManus Museum, which is in the kind of centre of Dundee. And I think sort of coming back to a kind of fair mind metals in my practice, part of maybe thinking about sustainable opportunities, like for example, I can't make everything that I make out of fair mined metals, because there are manufacturing restrictions when it comes to silver. I think last time I checked, I can only get it through a rolling mill about 75 millimeters kind of wide. So I'm having to design things based on those parameters. But when an opportunity arises where there's a design that allows, I always offer the option to clients for fair mined, rather than recycled. And it's for me giving the client that option and explaining the differences of a kind of sourcing is really useful. I guess after my PhD, or I don't think I hadn't actually technically graduated yet. But shortly after I'd finished the research for my PhD, I transitioned into a kind of managerial role for the ethical making program that was a run by the Scottish Goldsmiths Trust, which is now a sort of dormant charity. But this website, ethicalmaking.org, is still live, and has lots of kind of really useful sources on there, and just so much kind of inspiration and wee tips and tricks from so many different people at different stages in their careers about how they think about responsible practice, or how they source their materials or travel, and think about things. So it's kind of, yeah, thoroughly inspiring. Um, Again, I think continuing to have that skills exchange has been really kind of valuable. And I think as well as obviously I'm constantly reflecting on how I'm doing things in my practice. I think again, I mean, the more time you can spend with other different minded people, the better. Um, and I think as well, it's not always about spending time with kind of master craftsmen. Obviously, as grateful I am to a kind of master crafts people that I have had time with. I mean, there's amazing makers out there, like even like Megan Rigby, for example, um, who is just making the most mind-blowing kind of seal engraving that I've ever seen. And yes, obviously still, I mean, I think definitely younger than me. Um, and I think it's just incredible seeing the kind of the range of skill that people have, and not, yeah, not to assume that anyone's got more or less kind of value to share. Um, so again, I think just hopefully this just indicates that I enjoy making, and sort of sharing space with other people, learning. Um, and I think particularly with silversmithing, but also jewellery, I think often it can be a real challenge to take that sort of time to go out of your normal kind of routine and try new techniques and to actually develop your own skills. But I think thankfully, there are various kind of opportunities out there that you can now get kind of more and more funding, to do courses, etc. So I think for me, it's been such a useful um, activity or thing to engage with. Um, so I definitely recommend taking the time. I think more recently in the kind of, I'm kind of slightly aware of time, so I'm starting to wrap up. In kind of recent years, I have been maybe more critical of my practice, or just sensing that maybe something isn't right to begin with, and then I've started trying to articulate what that is. And I think for me, I mean, if the presentation hasn't already kind of indicated, I'm very kind of interested in the impact that my practice has. So again, going back to this kind of question of, is what I'm doing a narrative that is worth celebrating? Um, and I guess that impact is very much the purpose or the terms in which I am making. And I think knowing now, because obviously when I graduated, when I was aware that when someone's saying 100% recycled silver, you're trusting that that is indeed 100% recycled. Whereas now I'm a lot more skeptical about the definition of recycled silver in our industry, which again then makes you start to kind of question, should I be like, is making silverware out of recycled silver having the impact that I want to have in the world? And I think it's something I'm still grappling with. But one of the things that I did work towards last year was exploring a ring collection that was made in Fairmind or client's heirloom kind of metal. So this was moving, I mean, this collection will not be made in recycled material. Um, because I think for me, obviously, if you're looking at things like fair mind or fair trade metals, from a carbon perspective, it is very high compared to recycled. But the social and environmental impact for these relatively remote communities is really significant. So for me, in terms of the values that I have for my practice, that these are the sort of initiatives that I really want to back. So here you can obviously see the conditions in which they are mining our materials. And I guess this is another kind of example. So both in South America. So for me, knowing that the work that I'm creating is connected to that, but also connected to companies within the UK, sort of key tradespeople, that are able to help with some of the making process, whether that's the casting or hallmarking as well. Um, I think for me, that's the really important thing of who are the people and the environments that I am able to impact in my practice and being able to share that with clients as well, that you can actually show them where your materials are coming from and the people that you're making a difference to. Um, Another, I guess maybe this is possibly the most outside of my normal work. Again, last year I kind of took part in if I just jump ahead, the kind of In Focus virtual exhibition that Snag and Queer Metalsmiths collaborated on. So this was a kind of online collaboration or exhibition that was a for kind of BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities to share their sort of practice or share messages around their um, their thoughts and questions or issues that they wanted to share. So for me, I guess in recent years, my partners sort of changed their gender identity. And all of a sudden, I think there has been these kind of different experiences of now, well, there are kind of concerns around sort of transphobia and the kind of violence that that can create in the kind of public space. So I created this kind of pair of brooches that kind of reflect some of the kind of subconscious questions that I had. Um, and I think this kind of relates to, I can't remember which talk it was, that was hosted by the ACJ and the Goldsmith Centre, where Mark was sort of sharing his kind of brooch from the Meanings and Messages exhibition around the kind of, I guess, a kind of concerns of homophobia, even though they identify, I mean, they are gay. Um, and I think knowing that there's communities out there that are able to sort of share and navigate their way through kind of questions of identity, but also safety, I mean, I think it's kind of amazing that we've got these opportunities and kind of safe spaces within our jewellery community. So for these, I guess this is the first time I've engaged in sharing these issues. Um, so it's been kind of nice trying something different. So I think just to conclude, this is my last slide. Um, I've found it quite helpful to really kind of try to at least occasionally, periodically map out what it is that's important to me and what I'm trying to do. So it's definitely something I'd recommend for you to figure out, like to bring the focus into your practice or into your life in general. Um, so I guess for me, I mean, this kind of question of safety, whether it's the safety of obviously my partner, but also everyone through our sort of jewellery industry from miners, everybody in the supply chain, ensuring that there is that kind of health and safety and well-being for all of those people, and not to mention myself. Um, and I think obviously I love craft and making. Um, but I think as well, I've kind of noticed over time that I very much value advocating for others, which again kind of goes into, I mean, why I'm really interested in being part of the ACJ. Um, and then I suppose obviously I'm very interested in kind of innovation and education, which is I am kind of part-time lecturing at the Glasgow School of Art as well. And I am really interested in when we're thinking about narratives worth celebrating, for me, that is in my practice, I'm trying to work towards sustainable development or continually critically analysing what it is I'm doing and am I heading in the right direction? And thinking about different ways that I can bring compassion into my sort of practice as well. So I'm just going to stop sharing. So yeah, I don't know if there's any questions or any comments.
Well done, Karen. That's brilliant. Yeah, obviously, there's so much there. I mean, I'm sure there are questions. And if anybody's got anything to ask, please sort of raise your hand. I don't know if we've got all of the people on the screen at the moment, but that was absolutely really super, Karen. Excellent, really good. Um, I, I was quite interested. I mean, sort of, well, I suppose it was halfway through. I've made a couple of notes. One, I was actually amazed at the solar enameling. I thought, wow, what a thing to carry on with that. I mean, it's not something presumably that you could realistically carry on with. I mean, you were looking at it in a research way, presumably, were you?
Yeah, so I guess for the PhD, it very much was looking at it from a kind of technical sort of perspective. But saying that the lens that I was working with, I mean, you probably can buy, is effectively a kind of a square that would normally be used in a kind of light for like a stage light, for example, which you can easily sort of buy off of eBay for like 20, 30 pounds.
Mm.
The main sort of challenge with that is our unpredictable UK weather. Um, so trying to do that in Scotland when you've got an abundant amount of clouds is quite the challenge.
Mm.
So I guess part of the research was very much suggesting locations in the world that this technology would really be a lot more useful with or relevant for. Um, so like in India, for example, they already have they use these lenses for solar cooking. So they might also be able to use I mean the same equipment they already have to recycle materials. So it could be I mean recycling broken glass or aluminium, sort of melting that down. So there's slightly kind of broader applications that you could have with that lens. But there's no reason why you couldn't, if you've got a sunny, if you're in a sunny part of a
Well,
UK, you can certainly give it a go.
okay, thank you. Uh, Lynn,
Yeah, I wondered, did you use that lens to sinter the sand? That looked absolutely fascinating.
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think the samples that I had on that kind of map, I timed roughly 5 minutes of sunlight, and that was in Dundee, so I was on a kind
Wow.
of roof to do that. So it's not the uh, the effects would be much better the more central to the equator that you're going to be. So there is it's if you fancy a kind of search online later, there's a kind of graduate from the RCA called Marcus Kaiser, that had what's called the kind of Solar Center project. So I guess his work was part of my literature review, but he went to the desert or a desert in Egypt, and was effectively able to sinter kind of solid kind of bowls out of sand.
Wow.
So it's really quite remarkable. And I think there's a also kind of ancient examples. I can't remember. I can't remember the exact location. But I believe it was the Egyptians that there's kind of marks within the land somewhere. I can't remember exactly where. I'm assuming somewhere in Egypt, where they have. I mean, there's kind of hypotheses that they have been using sunlight to manipulate a kind of stone into glass and a
Wow.
different materials. Um, so it's in a way, and I guess as you maybe saw from that kind of introductory slides, of the kind of Archimedes sort of being said to be setting the kind of Roman fleet on fire, that again is there's kind of ancient stories or kind of narratives there that in a way part of my research was questioning, is there a place now when we've got this kind of framework of or kind of increased awareness of climate kind of change issues? Are there ways that we can use clean energy sources like the sun to be recycling and developing more kind of circular design practices?
Hmm. Thank you.
Anybody else? I um I was obviously your talk was talking about narratives. It was talking about your sort of, dare I say it, theoretical sort of stance to your subject, really, in a way, because at no point did you talk about sort of commercial aspects. At no point did you talk about the fact of having to adjust what you're designing for a particular market.
I think that it depends on how you're looking at it. So I suppose, I mean, as a creative, I am very much on I think with any kind of contemporary jeweler, there is this dilemma between pursuing your creative interests and entertaining or really kind of doubling down on the commercial aspect and how do the two relate. I think for me, I do lean more towards the kind of the creative side. But saying that, I think I know that one of the kind of concerns that a lot of people have around buying things like traceable materials that do come at that kind of premium cost, there is a concern that people might not want to buy your work. Um, I think inherently, because my designs are my designs, if people like what I'm making, they will buy it because there isn't a cheaper version in a different material elsewhere. Um, but yeah, I think it's quite an interesting kind of question that you pose in terms of the creative versus the kind of commercial. I would say, like, I think you might have noticed that the jewellery that I do make is more on the commercial side, which enables, I mean, at least the majority of the silverware that I make is a bit more sort of maybe creative and less commercial. So I think with any kind of collection, it's trying to strike that balance.
Very good, thank you, thank you. Um, what about the future? Have you got any particular plans, shall we say, short term, long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the last few years, I have really been thinking that I need to work on a new jewellery collection because I think for me, trying to manage the silverware and the jewellery and that identity of the two can be a real challenge. But I think particularly when I am realizing that maybe the silverware isn't having the sort of impact socially and environmentally that I would like it to, that I think jewellery does offer more potential in that sense. But saying that, it's for me, obviously, I've identified that fair mined metal is really important to me, and I do want to support those initiatives. But I'm not, again, thinking about the kind of the terms in which I'm wanting to make. To me, it's not about just churning out lots of gold rings. It's still about thinking about what meaningful narratives can I make for clients. And I think for me, through the type of work that I've made so far, it's about creating kind of more bespoke items and having that kind of quality connection with people and making something that is personal that they're going to want to keep for a long period of time and potentially pass on to kind of their loved ones. So I think it is thinking about that kind of the rate in which I'm creating the work as well, and how the user is then going to be kind of consuming that product as well. I think that definitely impacts how I think about the type of work that I'm making too. So I think it's just that slower practice. But saying that, I think I need to figure out a jewellery collection that maybe is more relevant to the things I'm really kind of excited about at the moment, that still aligns with all of those design parameters that I've just outlined. I should say as well, obviously, what I've shared this evening, it's very much how I've been making decisions based on my own values. I mean, there is no, I mean, that is not the right way. It's just my way of doing it. So I mean, I'd very much encourage everyone to, I mean, find their own way through that, kind of navigate through all their kind of values and thoughts as well.
Excellent. Oh, very good. Okay, well, on behalf of everybody else here, and who has been listening to Karen, but have had to sort of slope off, I'd like to thank Karen very much indeed for their presentation tonight. I think that's really stimulating, interesting, fulfilling, and I've certainly quite surprising. I have to admit it. Learned quite a lot that I didn't really think that I was going to learn tonight. So that's wonderful. So thank you very much, Karen, from all of us, and maybe a little show of appreciation, even though you're probably muted. Thank you very much.
No,
Thanks.
thank you all for listening. I appreciate it.
It's been great. Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye.